The year is 1971. Richard Nixon is president, gas prices are climbing, and Archie Bunker makes his debut on American television sets in the iconic TV series All in the Family. In terms of rock and roll, we see standbys like the Stones and the Who still going strong, but we also see the emergence of new genres like progressive rock and glam rock starting to come to the fore. Here's my personal top 10 albums list for the year 1971.
One of us is changing, or maybe we've just stopped trying. And it's too late, baby, now it's too late. Though we really did try to make it.
So what a way to start the year. This album was an absolute monster. 15 consecutive weeks at number one, 14 times platinum, 4 Grammy Awards, including Album of the Year. And if that wasn't enough, it also produced a massive hit for James Taylor with You've Got a Friend. His version was actually the biggest. And musically, I really think this record set the mold for what pop music was going to be throughout much of the 1970s. Particularly in those amazing, lush, mellow-sounding major seventh chords that are all over the place. It's funny, when I'm talking about major seventh chords with my students, I often refer to them as the 70s pop chords. And again, I think this record really had a lot to do with that. Frank Zappa, as usual, had a great quote about major sevenths. He said they sound like you're falling in love. And it's so true, just so soft and dreamy. Check it out, you got stuff like this. And it's too late, baby, now it's too late. B flat major 7, F major 7. What about you just call out my name? Hear that beautiful G major 7 there? I love it. And think about all those bands that were popular after this. Chicago, Bread, America, loaded with major sevenths. They really were the sound of the 70s.
Out here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here we is stone, immaculate. Now listen to this, I'll tell you about the heartache. I'll tell you about the heartache and the loss of God.
No eternal reward will forgive us now for wasting the dawn. What a great line. And honestly, a tune like that is why you have to love the Doors. So unique. Where have you ever heard a song like that before or since? Now, in my best albums of 1970, I featured Morrison Hotel and mentioned that that was a bit of a return to form, a little bit of a harder edge from the 2 previous albums. Well, LA Woman, the final Doors album, is even more so. This is pretty much a raw, gritty album from start to finish. Now, Doors fans will know that Morrison was not in good shape by this point. It was only about 3 months after the release of this album that he was no longer with us. By all accounts, he was not happy about being a teen idol, and he wanted to be taken more seriously as a poet. He was drinking heavily, he'd gained a ton of weight, grew a beard, and certainly looked more the part of the tortured poet. But as is often the case, unhappiness leads to great art. There's some really harrowing stuff on this record. I'm thinking of a tune like The Cars Hiss By My Window, which is so sinister, and even Riders on the Storm. I distinctly remember hearing that song on the radio as a young kid, and it kind of spooked me a little bit. Very dark stuff. Morrison is definitely not the smooth crooner of old here, but when his voice breaks on a tune like The Changeling or the title track, it just sounds that much better. And I think another brilliant move on this record is the production. When you listen to those first couple of albums, Morrison's voice is recorded with this very lush, flattering reverb. Here, the vocals are recorded flat and dry, but it's so perfect for this material. And I swear to God, you can hear that he's gained weight. You can hear it in his voice. He sounds heavy. He sounds a bit tired. He sounds like he's loaded. But again, it works so well. I thought about using one of the more well-known tunes there, like Brown Sugar or Wild Horses. But that tune there, Bitch, just gets me. I remember having that 45 as a little kid, Brown Sugar backed with Bitch. If there's a better rock and roll record than that, I don't know what it is. Also, one of the greatest uses of horns on a rock record, so great. I think this album really went a long way toward bringing the Stones into the modern incarnation that we know and love. Of course, Ron Wood was the missing piece that wouldn't come till a few years later. But other than that, this was the first album they released on their own record label, Rolling Stones Records, and therefore the first album to feature the famous lips and tongue logo, maybe the most recognizable logo in the history of rock. It was their first studio album after the death of Brian Jones, the first studio album to feature Mick Taylor. It was the first album by the Stones to reach #1 in both the US and the UK. First Andy Warhol cover, right? All things that we know and love about the Stones even today. And of course, being a Stones album, you know there's going to be at least a couple of those classic open G tune licks from Keith. So simple, but just those little subtle variations. And of course, Mick Taylor. I've seen Keith and Bill Wyman in separate interviews both say that Mick Taylor never really quite gelled with the band and that Ron Wood was a better fit. Wyman's exact words were, Woody's playing is more like Keith's playing than pretty, right? So Mick Taylor was the pretty player. And while I understand where they were coming from, it was really nice that we got Mick Taylor at least for a little while. His stuff is so great. Of course, the Can't You Hear Me Knockin' solo on this album will always be his most remembered solo as a Stone. You've got Wild Horses, possibly the greatest Stones ballad with the exception of Angie. And even a deep cut like Sway, which comes in right after Brown Sugar. It's a classic Stones thing. It's a head scratcher. There's really nothing to it. The changes are so simple. I think Mick actually plays the guitar on it, in fact. But there's something about it that just gets you. I once heard Keith Richards describe it as the factor X, which he said is the thing in rock and roll that's so important and that you just can't put down on paper. For me, this album is a classic example of why the vast majority of rock music journalists and critics are an utter waste of time. As with a lot of solo McCartney stuff, the critics just shredded it. Oh, this is Muzak, this is mindless doodling, this is just pop. And of course, the fans knew better. It was top 10. Uncle Albert Admiral Halsey became Paul's first #1 single post-Beatles. There's great music on this record, and we all knew it at the time, didn't we? And so now, more than 50 years down the road, a lot of these same critics are writing glowing retrospectives about what a revolutionary, groundbreaking album this was, how it was the first indie rock album. Just unbelievable. But lest you thought that uke on the wall was just for display, this album gives me a chance to break it out for what is probably my favorite tune on the record, Ram On. And this is a classic Paul move. Uke was not cool in those days. For you younger people, there was a guy called Tiny Tim, sort of a big scary guy that strummed a uke and sang in this weird high falsetto. And so for my generation, uke was the most uncool thing in the world. I know it's made a resurgence of late, but Paul didn't care and he went for it. Great little chord progression in Ram On. We've got D flat major 7 to B flat minor. Okay, that's 1 and 6 in the key of D flat. Sounds beautiful. Then we get this abrupt change to C, which I love. And of course it's McCartney, so he seems to have the ability to just spit out incredible melodies without even trying. Ram on, give your heart to somebody. Such a great record. You've got Backseat of My Car, which should have been a huge hit. Dear Boy, another really pretty song. And Uncle Albert, Admiral Halsey, which I've already mentioned. One of those great Paul tunes like Band on the Run that seems like about 3 or 4 songs all in one.
Spend some time feeling inferior, standing in front of my mirror, comb my hair in 1,000 ways, but I came out looking just the same.
Rod Stewart has always been one of the greatest what-ifs in rock and roll. Clearly the guy's a legend. He's had a phenomenal career, and clearly he's got one of the greatest voices in the history of rock and roll. But a lot of people feel that for many years he's wasted his abilities on subpar material. Well, Every Picture Tells a Story is not subpar material. So yeah, I can see it. One wonders what amazing things he could have produced if he had continued on that path. And don't get me wrong, some of the later 70s stuff like Tonight's the Night, Do You Think I'm Sexy? I like it. I think it's fun. Maybe it's partly nostalgia. I don't know. But yeah, this record is something else altogether. The 2 lead singles on this album, Every Picture Tells a Story and Maggie May, are incredible. To me, they've always felt like this great pairing, like parts 1 and 2 of the same story of a young man heading out to make his way in the world. And Every Picture Tells a Story. He's traipsing around Europe. You get those great lyrics. Down in Rome, I wasn't getting enough of the things that keep a young man alive. My body stunk, but I kept my funk in a time when I was right out of luck. And then, of course, in Maggie May, he meets up with the older woman, and you get more of those great poignant lyrics. The morning sun, when it's in your face, really shows your age. But that don't worry me none. In my eyes, you're everything. I also love Mandolin Wind. You've got the great cover of I Know I'm Losing You, which really showcases Stewart's bluesy vocals. And finally, you've got a really star-studded cast of players here. You've got Ron Wood, Ronnie Lane, Ian McLagan, Kenny Jones on drums, who of course later replaced Keith Moon in The Who, and Maggie Bell, the female vocalist who does that great backup part on Every Picture Tells a Story.
I am on a lonely road and I am traveling, 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 looking for something. What can it be? Oh, I hate you some, I hate you some, I love you.
I'd have to put Joni right up there with maybe John Lennon as one of the most intensely personal songwriters ever. Apparently, when Chris Christopherson first heard this album, he said, "Joni, keep something to yourself," which is kind of funny. But I'm glad that she didn't, because this is what makes Joni, Joni. Joni's lyrics are often filled with doubt and regret, and this album is no exception. She had just ended her relationship with Graham Nash, and during the recording of this album was in a relationship with James Taylor, who was dealing with a heroin addiction. So there are references to these things in the lyrics. The tune we heard in the intro, All I Want, has that line about, I want to knit you a sweater. That was directed at Taylor. And in the title track, Blue, there are references to the heroin addiction. Pretty intense. Blue made it to number 15 in America, which is very good. But the real story here is in the critical accolades. Rolling Stone once placed it at number 3 on their top 500 albums of all time. And NPR once put this album as the number 1 best album by a female artist ever. Pretty heady stuff. Musically, the arrangements tend to be very sparse on this album, generally either dulcimer or piano. And that's fine because these songs don't need any grandiose production. And I love Joni's piano playing. She uses these great jazz voicings. It's no surprise that a lot of jazz artists cover her stuff. I once saw jazz pianist Herbie Hancock do an entire show dedicated to Joni Mitchell material, which was really fun. And finally, I think Joni's voice is in peak form here. It's come down a little bit from the very early folky stuff. And after this album, it really started to come down and deepen a lot, which was still cool. But for me, this is a happy medium. Peak Joni singing here.
So when I stand naked, stoned and stabbed, I call that a bargain, the best I ever had. The best I ever had.
So all you Who fans out there will know, this record was originally intended as a concept album, another rock opera in the tradition of Tommy. But in the end, Pete Townshend just couldn't bring it all together, so they just made a conventional album. And you know, I think it's probably for the best. This thing is so great as just a good old-fashioned rock and roll album. And if they had gone through with the concept, for example, we wouldn't have had John Entwistle's contribution, My Wife, which is a great little tune. I always look forward to the 1 or 2 Entwistle songs on a Who album. The prominent use of a synthesizer on Baba O'Riley and Won't Get Fooled Again was pretty revolutionary. It made it to number 1 in the UK, number 4 in the US. How it didn't make number 1, I'll never know. But as it is with a lot of these classic albums, maybe it didn't top the charts, but it's produced so many lasting tunes. You cannot turn on a classic rock station any day of the week without hearing Baba O'Riley, Won't Get Fooled Again, Bargain, Behind Blue Eyes. Pretty much every tune on this album receives play. There's not a weak track. Townshend's lyrics are brilliant throughout, as usual. He has this incredible knack for writing memorable youth rebellion lines. I talked about My Generation in my Best Lyricists video, and he's got a couple of more classics here. They're All Wasted in Baba O'Riley, Meet the New Boss, Same as the Old Boss in Won't Get Fooled Again. And finally, probably the most underrated aspect of The Who is Townshend's rhythm guitar playing. It's just unbelievable. Do yourself a favor and look up Won't Get Fooled Again isolated guitar track on YouTube. It's a great listen.
In a garage by the motorway, he was born upon the Tool Pond on a Christmas day, when the New York Times said God is dead and the war's begun.
And Elton John's brilliant 4th album, Madman Across the Water, is another one that experienced kind of a slow burn in terms of popularity. It did well enough on release, made it to number 8 on Billboard, was certified gold in 1972, but only gained in popularity by 1998. It had been certified double platinum. So again, a lot of the great albums, people don't really get them at first. But along those lines, the real head scratcher is the brilliant song Tiny Dancer, which only made it to 41 upon initial release. Now, the song is very long. It's over 6 minutes, which was not common on the radio back then. So a lot of the DJs thought they were going to be smart and played an edit. But the problem is that song really needs to be 6 minutes long. The whole thing about it is that slow build-up, And then you finally get to the chorus well over 2 minutes in, and it's like this great release. Just a great example of how you don't want to mess with an artist's vision. Things generally go badly. And of course, Tiny Dancer got a boost in the year 2000 when Cameron Crowe used it in the climactic scene for his great rock and roll film, Almost Famous. Do you remember that scene where the entire band and the entourage just belted out on the tour bus? So great. And of course, we have to mention Leave On, the other single from the album. Those great, intriguing lyrics by Bernie Taupin, Elton's longtime collaborator. And like Tiny Dancer, featuring an incredible string arrangement by Paul Buckmaster, who worked with so many great artists of the time.
Mama said the way you move, gonna make you sweat, gonna make you groove.
And so, of course, Led Zeppelin's fourth album has to be on this list. Zeppelin fans will know that officially this album is untitled. Everybody called it Zeppelin 4, but the band never really gave it a title. I always thought that was such a great Zeppelin thing. They were really big on mystery. I also love the fact that the album cover had no writing on it whatsoever. What the group did was each band member chose their own little symbol to represent them. And when I was in high school, a lot of the kids called this album Zoso, thinking that Jimmy Page's symbol spelled that word, although he has denied that many times. But whatever you call it, this is a classic. Like its predecessor, this album has that great mix of light and heavy. You've got the rockers like Black Dog and Misty Mountain Hop, and then the hippie acoustic stuff, Going to California, Battle of Evermore, both of which feature mandolin prominently. And then there's When the Levee Breaks, which can only be described as that weird psychedelic blues style that Zeppelin had. And with that drum intro, which is still the standard of best drum sound ever put to tape and is sampled to this day. And I haven't mentioned Stairway to Heaven yet. Do I need to? Maybe the most classic rock song of all time. And kind of a funny note, there are a couple of tunes on this record that have befuddled bar bands for decades. First of all, you've got Black Dog, amazing riff, actually written by John Paul Jones, the bassist, and not Jimmy Page, as would usually be the case. But that one, with all its tricky time changes, kind of wacky. And maybe the greatest rock and roll with that drum intro. And I swear to God, we all thought that first snare hit came in on the one, but as Greg Bissonette and other great drummers have pointed out, it actually starts on the and of 3. It's based on a Chuck Berry guitar lick, believe it or not. It's a pickup. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 1, and 2, and 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 3, and 4, and boom. I wish I would have known that back when I played this with my cover band.
I'll be the roundabout. The words will make you out and out and spend the day your way. Call it morning, driving through the sun and in and out the valley.
In my intro, I mentioned that progressive rock was a genre that was starting to become popular around this time. And Yes was probably the band that made that happen more than any other. One thing that blows my mind, this album made it to number 4 on the Billboard chart. The fact that an album this musically complex and challenging could get that high is insane. And actually, to me, it's really sad. That would never happen today. And to me, it just shows how far pop music has fallen over the years. A really interesting feature of this album is that it has 4 tracks, which are group arrangements, and then 5 others that are individual efforts by all of the band members, where they get to sort of showcase their own virtuosity. The singer, John Anderson, has a track called We Have Heaven. Guitarist Steve Howe does a little guitar solo, Mood for a Day. I can still remember trying to learn that on my acoustic as a kid. Keyboardist Rick Wakeman has a thing called Cans and Brahms. Chris Squire, the bassist, a thing called The Fish. And drummer Bill Bruford has 5% for Nothing. It's a really interesting idea, and I only found out recently that the genesis of this was really time and budget constraints. But I think it's a cool idea, and I think it's an example of necessity being the mother of invention. And of course, Roundabout will always be the most remembered Yes song from this period. Instantly catchy, you can groove to it, but the musicianship is off the hook. I love that grinding bass tone that Chris Squire gets that had to be influential on later prog bassists like Geddy Lee. And to this day, when I'm teaching my guitar students about harmonics, I use that classic intro as an example. I play that and they go, "Oh yeah, I've heard that before." And that little acoustic tag that Steve Howe plays on the beginning and the end is a great example of the kind of classical influence that he often brought in. So that's it for now. Rest assured, I will be working my way through the entire decade of the 70s. Then I'll probably go back and catch some 60s and maybe eventually 80s. These are fun to do. As always, I'd love to see your top 10 in the comments. Talk to you soon.